Hello and welcome. I'm sitting here with full-time cartoonist and part-time troublemaker, Scott Chantler. Or is it the other way around?
One or the other.
You may remember him from such Schuster Award-winning and Eisner-nominated works like Northwest Passage, Two Generals, and the Three Thieves series. We're sitting down with some beverages to talk about his latest graphic narrative with Simon & Schuster's graphic imprint, Gallery 13, Bix. And we hope you are too. Scott, hello. Cheers.
Oh, cheers.
What are you drinking?
This is a little bit of scotch. I couldn't tell you what it is exactly, but it's delicious.
Well, scotch is an excellent choice, sir.
It is.
Well, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Bix, the book, and the man?
Okay, Bix, the book, and the man. We'll edit out all the ums and throat clearing while I think about the answers. Bix Beiderbecke was a jazz cornetist in the 1920s. He was really the first white musician to contribute significantly to the development of jazz. He was a real outsider in that world. He was a white guy from Iowa and got it into his head he was going to become a jazz musician and became quite a good one. He and if you're wondering where a white kid from Iowa even hears jazz in the late teens, early 20s, he was young right when recording started to become a thing. In fact, the first jazz record ever is one that his brother Bernie brought home when he returned home from serving overseas in the First World War. And so Bix definitely heard that record and was inspired by it. Bix also lived in Davenport, Iowa, just a stone's throw from the Mississippi River. And this would have been the era of the riverboats and all the musicians from New Orleans traveling up and down the Mississippi on those riverboats. So he would have heard any number of New Orleans musicians traveling up and down the river, you know, if not from his house, then certainly from the nearby riverbanks. And my book chronicles his short and fairly tragic but very interesting life, and tries to do it in a way that I hope is worthy of Bix artistry.
I remember when you first told me about this project 4 years ago. At the time, you didn't think anyone would really take a chance on such an experimentally formatted, nearly wordless graphic novel. For those emerging creators out there who are trying to get new and maybe unconventional projects noticed, can you tell us how you think about crafting or pitching more unconventional projects like Bix to make sure they can get noticed by publishers?
I got an agent.
Well, that's one way.
Yeah. For me, I have always... had always been successful getting my own work into print until it came to Bix, which is just too weird. It's not just that it's silent, it's that it's trying to visualize music in different ways, and it's a challenging project. It's a project that demands a lot from the reader, and just trying to describe it to someone in a pitch was difficult. Trying to make them see it. Mm-hmm.
It's taking one art form and putting it through the lens of another.
Right. Yes. It's trying to describe music visually, and that is a hard thing to, like I say, make people see what that's going to look like on the page.
And because comics can take such a long time to be created, this took you 4 years, basically, research to execution. Mm-hmm. You really have to be able to communicate what the idea is up front in a way that someone can understand it to invest those 4 years into making the project.
Oh, yeah. Comics is a very... it's the kind of business where you gotta sell the book first, then create it. You know, otherwise you don't risk putting that many years and that many hours over the years into that much drawing if there isn't a paycheck up front, during, and on the back end too. You know,
you gotta paid at every level.
Right. Yeah, you cannot risk those years on a payday maybe down the road. So yeah, this was the book that finally made me break down and find an agent, because I wouldn't have been able to sell it on my own. Lord knows I tried. I have an open door to pitch, several places, and I went to all my usual editors and said, "Hey, look what I got," and they were all like, "That's great. This looks really fascinating. I hope someone will publish it someday, but it won't be us."
Well, I'm glad you broke the barrier with Simon & Schuster. I'm glad they looked at it and said this is for us, because it turned out to be a stunning project.
Well, once I had an agent lined up, Samantha Haywood at Transatlantic. Hey, Samantha. It made me wish I'd gotten an agent 10 years ago.
So she's like your own personal superhero.
Pretty much. She really opened the door to that American book market, which... the trajectory of my career has been American comics publishers and then Canadian book publishers, and the only place really left to go was American book publishers. But that's a hard nut to crack. They are probably not going to deal with somebody who's not being represented by an agent, and a good one. Okay. So, yeah, that's how that all worked out.
So when you're starting to think about your next writing project, do you basically say to yourself, where do I want to go? Oh, Chicago. Well, I'll write a book so I can do it as a research project.
Yeah, I did go to Chicago, but most of the travel research was really done in Davenport, Iowa, which is where Bix grew up. And I really wanted to go and walk those streets and see the Mississippi and hang out on the waterfront and just...
What do you get from living that wouldn't come across if you didn't go?
I don't know, just a sense of the place and the geography of the place and the feel of it and the people. I mean, we're talking 100 years later from most of the Davenport scenes in my book, but you can still get a sense of what the place was like 100 years ago.
It definitely got crazy amount of history, and as well, which is represented in its cityscape and its architecture and its music and its lifestyle.
Sure, like any place, a lot of the 100 years ago isn't that long in terms of a city's history. So there's a lot of there's a lot of buildings and stuff that would have been there in Bix's time, and certainly just the general layout of the place, and the Mississippi hasn't gone anywhere.
No, I suppose it's still pretty much the same.
Yeah.
When you were sitting down to actually start drawing out Chicago and Davenport, what did you absolutely love about depicting those scenes, and what did you absolutely hate?
About Davenport specifically?
Davenport and Chicago, just drawing them, the physical drawing of those cities. What was the most fun to do, and what was the least?
Well, Chicago has some great landmarks, like the Chicago Theater, which would have been brand new at the time that Bix was hanging out in Chicago. So there's actually a panel in the book of the sign being erected at the Chicago Theater, and that was fun. But yeah, cities are fun to draw. They have their own character. The bits in Davenport that were fun to draw were Bix's house.
But maybe also one of the least fun things to draw about 25 times in that book.
Well, yes, we keep coming back to the house, and it's always the same image of the house, only the tree out front grows and the seasons change. And there's a reason for that. I'm trying to make a point about the unchangingness of that environment. But yeah, you're right. Maybe the house was fun to draw the first 2 times. But after that, it may have gotten a little repetitive.
We also have to talk about the unique format of this book, which is drawn in a uniform 5-panel strip throughout to represent Bix's life, and which sometimes moves up and down when he's playing classical music, and a more relaxed page layout when he's listening to or playing jazz music. Aside from the confinement or freedom this shows that Bix is experiencing in the story, how did this approach to drawing Bix confine or free you creatively?
Well, I always find it's interesting to set certain restrictions. And comics, print comics at least, are restricted by the edges of the page. You can do a lot with comics layout. It's pretty free. But you are restricted by those four edges of the page. And so how you work within that and divide that space up becomes very meaningful. So the genesis for what I did with Bix actually began way back with my book Two Generals, which hopefully people listening to this will know, is about my grandfather's experiences in the Second World War. And it has a very strict 9-panel grid layout, which works well for that story because, as I say, the more you divide the page up, the more you're dividing it up into smaller increments of time. And that book to me was very much about the small moments, not the big battles, which certainly occur by the end of the book. The last 20 pages or so are a bloodbath. But it's about the small moments of waiting and fear and all that stuff that goes on, for a year before the big battle. So that kind of layout worked well for that book, like this strict staccato military rhythm to the images. While I was working on that book, I thought a lot about what would the opposite of this be if I were to take this kind of thinking about the rhythm of visual imagery and apply it to something that wasn't a military story. How would that work? And so with Bix, like you say, it starts out in a very linear, strict, limited format where it's essentially a 5-panel comic strip on each page, each panel the same size and shape. When the book is open, it actually becomes a 10-panel strip right across. And then, as you say, the panels begin to kind of move up and down like notes on a musical scale. And that's when he's introduced to classical music when he's very young. And then we break out of that even further, like you say, when he discovers jazz, and the book layout becomes as free as the music he's listening to. And as his music evolves, so too do the page layouts. But as he deteriorates physically and mentally because of his alcoholism, we are eventually forced back into that constraining, straightforward 5-panel repetitive beat. And so that tells the story, even without, I'm obsessed with the musicality of comics and the rhythm of stories. And this is why I have always wanted to do a story about music or about a musician. And so I really like the panels themselves to tell a story before you even fill in the little boxes.
It really is phrases within phrases, like a general crescendo and a general decrescendo.
Before you even draw the little people in the little boxes, I want the boxes themselves to be describing the story as much as they can.
And this is why I'm wondering if it was maybe as freeing as it was confining, because let's say your overall phrase of the visuals is 4 beats, but you have a 5-panel layout for this phrase. Do you start thinking, oh no, how am I going to figure out that middle beat when really it should be 4? Did you struggle with that?
Sure. There were certainly, particularly in the scenes that had to, every page had to have 5 beats on it. And I'm fairly strict about having each page be a single idea. I think of panels as like a sentence and a page as like a paragraph. Like you say, beats within beats and rhythms within rhythms. And so, sometimes it was tough if a particular scene only had 4 beats in it, or maybe it had 6 or 7. Does that become 1 page, or does it become 2 pages?
And then that might throw off the rest of the rhythm of the book based on how it's going to open.
I mean, the turn pages are important, so you got to think about everything in terms of a 2-page section as well. You very much think in terms of panels and pages and spreads. So yeah, it's a lot to juggle. But yes, I was going to say playing that strictness against the freedom is the story. Mm. That's what Bix's story is about. It's what my book is about. It's it is a story about the tension between structure and the lack of it.
Mm-hmm. And that is maybe indicative of not only that era, but it has started to be indicative of our own, that we have a certain set of rules that we are kind of confined to, and when you try to break out of those rules, it becomes more difficult to navigate your life or society.
Well, what appealed to me, I could have made this book about virtually any musician or any artist in any genre or form, really, and that's kind of the point. Is that Bix's story reflects a lot of what artists in general go through, and maybe to a lesser degree what people in general go through. Mm-hmm. We're all trying in some way to burst out of the conditions we were born in, whether it's the color of our skin or poverty or any number of things.
And all those factors still make us who we are. Like, Bix could not have been himself without those factors and without pushing against those factors.
Absolutely.
And, like, in this story, you also have many echoes or many refrains, if you want to think about it that way, like between the trumpet and the liquor bottle, performance being private or public, beginning and ending relationships, the course of living and dying. So can you tell us a little bit about building up these visual parallels in this book and how they come to overall impact the story?
Well, I really like that kind of stuff anyway. I mean, if you're working in a visual medium, you should be trying to make those visual connections between things. Otherwise, what do you got to draw? For me, because this book is mostly silent, for people who haven't seen the book, there's maybe 24 lines of dialogue in the entire 250 pages. It was even more important that the story find those visual connections between things and make those meanings. So you mentioned the connections between the booze bottles and the cornet. Mm-hmm. It's both things that he puts to his lips and that he's intoxicated with. Mm-hmm. That was an easy one. I also make a connection between the piano, which we connect in the book to classical music, and his parents' religion. This is a music that his parents at least approve of. Mm-hmm. This is... if Bix had become a classical musician, I think it would have been a much easier road for him and maybe an easier pill for his parents to swallow as well.
There's like levels of acceptance to what you're allowed to do.
Sure. Yes, exactly. So, there's a lot of that throughout the book. I tried to draw a lot of... there's a lot of just direct parallels between that booze bottle and that cornet and the cross and the piano and all that stuff. Like I say, when you're dealing with a textless narrative, you've got to use every tool. You got to use every tool. You got to make that as clear as can be. You've got to really hammer those connections into people's eyeballs and brains, because you can't. A character can't just walk into the room and say it.
This is how I'm feeling.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the visual artistry of the story, but biographical comics have two intertwined parts. It's the artistic storytelling part, where the artist can take some liberties, and the real historical facts of the era or person you're writing about. So tell me a little bit about your research process and how you try to balance story and history.
Well, that's always the trick. Fortunately, because I had done Two Generals 10 years ago, I have some experience with this stuff. I learned a lot making Two Generals about just that push and pull between history and fiction, and how much to fictionalize, and how much of your research goes in and how much of your stuff goes in. It's a really delicate balance, and you have to pretty much have done it once to appreciate how much of a juggling act it really is. When I started out doing Two Generals, my idea was that it would be my grandfather's story and not mine, that everything in it would be directly from his, his diary and the documents of his that I had, and from official histories and that kind of thing. I learned very quickly, that is not possible. That is just not how history works. Any subject that you're researching, you are inevitably going to find two sources that do not agree. They may even be very reliable sources, first-person sources, eyewitnesses that do not agree. and you have to make a decision about who's right, or whether the truth lies somewhere down the middle, someplace. Yeah, I started having to make judgment calls on two generals right away.
Is it also that, like, you have a lived experience, and so the way you can experience history is through your lived experience?
Well, inevitably, you are structuring this thing, and you are starting with a mountain of research, and you're going through it, deciding what needs to be in the book and what does not need to be in the book. And simply by making those decisions, you are imposing your interpretation on the thing. And even if your interpretation is choosing who else's interpretation is correct,
or will color
the thing, yeah. Any notion of an objective view of history is suspect in my eyes. I mean, there are certain things that are fact.
But it's more like histories.
Sure.
Maybe.
I mean, there are dates and things that are hard and fast that, we know, we can stick a pin in a thing and say that is a fact. But there is a lot of opinion and subjectivity to history.
A lot of wiggle room, I guess.
A lot. There is a lot of wiggle room.
Well, how does this compare to, like you mentioned, writing your grandfather's biography in Two Generals, but you've also worked on the true story of the 1934 Chatham Colored All-Stars, which was put on by the University of Windsor and the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society, amongst others. When you're writing a personal biography, one of your grandfathers, in comparison to a biography of a historical time or individual you've never met, what's at stake in both situations? Do you make different considerations because one is more personalized and one is more removed?
There is certainly a sense of responsibility to both. I mean, in one respect, Two Generals was different because it was my family history. And so I didn't have to feel bad about mucking out around in somebody else's family story like I sometimes did with Bix. On the other hand, if I had mucked that up, if Two Generals had been a disaster, my name is all over the thing, and so is his, right? I think it's a lot of responsibility either way. Yeah, it's a high wire act for sure.
Well, you say in the introduction to Bix that his life was a bit apocryphal. Can you tell us a little bit about negotiating the mysteries you found in Bix's life? Maybe how you handled those pieces of contradictory information. Was there anything you wanted to really put in the book and didn't? Or anything that you did and then later second-guessed?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that drive Bix historians, of which there actually are some. There is a small...
We've met some of those guys.
Yeah, there is a small but hardcore group of Bix Beiderbecke historians on the internet. Where else? And the Beiderbecke family themselves react badly to... I can think of at least a couple of things that really drive them up the wall. And I am sympathetic to that. It must be tough to... have family history out there that does not conform with what you have been told is the family history. I am completely sympathetic to that view. There are certain things that I've included in the book that would be included among those bits of Bix lore, and I have no problem calling them lore, and I do call them apocryphal in the introduction, which is to say that they are things that are widely reported as true that are of, questionable origin. Which is not to say they're untrue, but, cannot be or haven't been substantiated. The one in particular that, I know people probably haven't read the book while they're listening to this, but there's a bit where Bix, he's been, throughout the story, sending home records, test pressings, and such to his parents, proudly. And then, when he is home for a bit of a rest, as the story is heading into its third act, he finds them unopened in the closet. This is a bit of Bix mythology that is probably mythology, but that I can't say for sure whether it happened or not. In my mind, if it's a bit of a coin toss. If it's mythology, I think it's important because I think the reason why it's so widely repeated in Bix biographies is that it's something that is very recognizable to artists. I think artists, like most people, or maybe more so than most people, want their parents' approval. It is their biggest fear not to get it or to have it. So, real or not, I saw this scene as just an expression of Bix's worst fear. And the way I've framed it in the book hopefully will come across with a bit of a question mark above it. He has been having, again, people probably haven't read the book, but he has been having hallucinations coming from withdrawal from his alcoholism up to that point in the book. And the way I frame that scene in the book is that it might have happened or not.
Well, his own viewpoint is a bit unreliable as we go further and further into the book, and as is our own viewpoints on ourselves oftentimes. We can't see ourselves subjectively and objectively, so our perspective colors how we see and feel things.
I have a epigraph at the beginning of the book that includes 3 quotes, and the last of which is from the headmaster, John Wayne Richards, of Bix's private school. And it says, "Bix is a very clever excuse maker, and I think he sometimes fools even himself in a way." I put that at the beginning of the book very deliberately as a signpost for people to say that this is an unreliable narrator, and we see throughout the book that Bix is a great liar.
Even to himself.
And I say that fairly lovingly. I'm not disparaging him at all.
He's a bit of a raconteur.
He is a Bix was an interesting character, and that's one of the reasons why this book exists. But yes, his letters home to his parents are full of the kind of
things you tell your parents?
The kind of things you tell your parents about how it's going.
What you're up to.
And it's tough to... This bit about the records in the closet, if it is true, comes from something he told a friend and got spread around, and, maybe some other musician friends as well. And maybe they just wanted to believe it. Maybe it's been misreported. Maybe it's been misremembered. Yeah. Maybe it's... Who even knows? Mm-hmm. It's tricky. That, of all the historical stuff I have ever done, that was the trickiest thing to deal with and resolve. And I think just by having it be a question mark in the book was the best I could. I think it's important, true or not, because like I say, I think it reflects a certain amount of anxiety on Bix's part and all of our parts, that our parents approve of us and what we do. But yeah, whether or not that's a fact, I will leave it up to the reader to decide.
Well, speaking of things that you didn't put into the book, I know you briefly considered putting in an epilogue that featured other prominent artists who died young throughout history, like Bix did, an homage to what is known as the 27 Club. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this theme plays out in the book and why you ultimately decided to leave such an epilogue out?
Well, it wasn't going to be an epilogue. I was going to sort of entwine that. I mean, this never made it even to the thumbnail stage, but something that was in my head that might be interesting when I was writing was because Bix did have hallucinations, I thought it might be interesting to have his hallucinations be of other musicians that would follow in Bix's wake by destroying themselves in their late 20s.
It's like the From Hell sequence in Eddie Campbell and Alan Moore's book where you get the pop-up.
That is exactly what I had in mind.
Okay, I see where you're going.
That is exactly what I had in mind, was those bits in From Hell where, Gull...
Like, did he precipitate something?
Gull, Jack the Ripper, perceives a future that he helps create. And that is all throughout the book. I mean, we've seen multiple times in the last century musicians, just begin their fame and then destroy themselves with drugs or alcohol or what have you. And, Bix may well have been the blueprint for that. I know it's very, it's not the way people think of jazz in the 20s, but it was the Prohibition era. These guys were drinking like crazy, and stuff that was
made in a bathtub.
Yeah, you didn't want an open flame near the stuff these guys were drinking. So that kind of thing permeates the book. And again, going back to the epigraph, another one of the quotes in the epigraph is from Benny Green, who said, "The listening musician, whatever his generation or his style, recognizes Bix as a modern, modernism being not a style but an attitude." So that's a thing I really wanted would clue in the reader to the fact that this is a story we've seen again and again in the last 100 years, and that there's a lot about Bix. I really wanted to hit the stuff in the book that was modern about Bix. I mean, I'm very clear that this is the 1920s we're in, but hopefully I don't hit people over the head with it. That this is a story that could be set in the 50s or the 90s, and was, right? With different people. So to get back to your original question, one of the thoughts I had originally was that some of these withdrawal-based hallucinations Bix would have would be of Janis Joplin or of Kurt Cobain. Mm-hmm. At some point he hallucinates two Mexicans under his bed. Mm-hmm. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if the Mexicans were like, quote-unquote Mexicans, were Jim Morrison and Amy Winehouse, mm-hmm. Right? I discarded that idea because I wanted to stay a little closer to reality. That felt a little too fictionalized. Felt like imposing my stuff on it a little bit too much.
Okay, that's one of those balancing acts we talked about.
But that was an early idea that got discarded, but which I hope does come across a little more subtly.
Still translates.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. Well, it's often said that to be a good writer, you should write what you know about. What is it in telling Bix's story that reflects what you know?
Oh, so much. I mean, there's a reason I picked Bix. As I said before, there's something about his story that feels pretty universal to artists. And I think that's why he's been kind of held up and romanticized as a kind of a patron saint of disaffected artist types. Yeah, there's a certain degree to which I also am an artist from an unlikely place, a small town in southwestern Ontario, Canada, working in an unlikely medium of comics. I didn't become a screenwriter or a director or a novelist of any sort. I'm doing this for better or worse. And yeah, like I say, I kind of came out of a bit unlikely place to do that. The internet makes it easy now to work remotely and be a creative freelancer from just about anywhere, but that wasn't the case when I was growing up, surely. So being from St. Thomas, Ontario, and declaring that you're gonna do this was a bit weird. My parents, like Bix's parents, I think, Mom was supportive, but maybe didn't quite understand. Dad maybe took a little longer to come around. I mean, both my parents were totally cool with it after I was successful, after I was up and running doing this, and it was clear that, it wasn't
It also
just a phase I was going to grow out
to
of.
generational ideas
Yeah.
of success. Like, what is success? It's what we know.
Sure.
It's what, like, and, you know, parents want their kids to be successful, but maybe don't know how they're being successful and what they're pursuing.
Sure, exactly. Especially if your parents are non-artists, which mine weren't, and neither were Bix's. Although his mom taught piano, so you know that's why she got it a little more. Like anything, a lot of that is probably projecting my own fears, right? Like I wanted my parents to approve and worried that they didn't, and I think a lot of the same is true of Bix. I mean, the parents here are depicted from his point of view, and that we see a lot of them frowning and worrying. But hopefully the final panels of the book make it clear that they just cared about their boy and were worried about him, and rightfully so. So, you know, now at 48 years old, I can kind of, and I'm a father to 2 teenage boys, so I can kind of see this from being a young rebellious artist type side, and also from a parent's side, and I hope a lot of that ended up in the book.
Okay.
I hope people don't think that I'm being too hard on the parents here. Like I say, I hope the final panels will convince people that I have more sympathy for the parents than maybe was obvious throughout.
Okay. Well, just to put a button on this conversation, in the end, what do you hope the reader comes away with after reading Bix's story through your graphic storytelling lens?
Oh. I hope the universality of it, like I say, comes across. I hope people can relate. Like I say, not everybody is an artist and who's charging out and doing new things and reinventing art forms and contributing to the development of this and that. But hopefully people can relate whatever to their own life in terms of, you know, having some sense of some grand thing you're supposed to do, but not quite knowing how to do it, and stepping on your own feet and having to negotiate parental expectations and social expectations. And
Oh my God, you wrote my life story.
that's right. See? Good. I hope.
I get it.
Yeah, I hope people can relate to it on that level, where it's like, oh, this is just an amplified version of what I myself have gone through trying to express myself in whatever way that is. And it's not really important to my book what Bix's music sounded like. Like I said, I'm trying to keep it kind of universal, and that it's just important that he's doing something creative and different. But I hope people will check out Bix's music. Like, I hope if you got a Spotify account, you know, bring up the Bix Beiderbecke page and listen to the top 5 tracks or so. Particularly the tracks that are important to my story are Singin' the Blues with Frank Trumbauer and In a Mist. Listen to those 2 for sure, because they're pretty interesting. I mean, 20s jazz seems a bit alien to our ear now. It's going back a ways. It's certainly not you know, the popular style, or has been the popular style for a long time, but you know, you may have to train yourself to hear it a little bit. But it's interesting, sophisticated, and very personal music he was making. So people should check that out, and I hope they will.
Wonderful. Well, after hearing us talk about this book for about an hour, I'm sure the listeners are going to want to get a hold of their very own copy. So why don't you tell them where they can do that?
Haha! Given these times, this is being recorded at the height of the COVID crisis, please support a local independent bookseller or comic shop if they are doing delivery or curbside pickup. Given that we're recording this for tcaf 2020, at least in its virtual state, if you live anywhere that the Beguiling delivers, you should support the Beguiling, because they are good people and could use your support.
And if they want a signed copy, you've got a couple dozen.
There are a few left available through my online store if you absolutely must have a signed copy. My online store at Big Cartel, Scott Chantler, Scott Chantler / Big Cartel.
We'll put it up for them.
I'll flash it on the screen because right now on the spot I cannot remember the address. But if you go to my website and click on the store link, it'll take you right there. And I do have a few copies left that I could sign and send out to people because I'm a good guy.
You are.
All right.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Scott. It's been Scott Chantler with his new book, Bix, published by Gallery 13 on behalf of the Toronto Comic Arts Festival of 2020. Thank you for listening.
Yay.